All right, good afternoon. Welcome to our online debate organized by the Clingendael Institute. My name is Louise van Schijk and I'm head of the EU and Global Affairs Unit at Clingendael. Clingendael is the Netherlands Institute for International Relations. It is an independent think tank academy on international affairs, and our aim is to contribute to a secure, sustainable and just world. With regard to climate change, we do a lot of activities on the climate security nexus, the geopolitics of the energy transition, and the European Green Deal, including its external dimension. We also do quite a bit of work in the field of trade and economic security. Today, we are here to debate the international dimension of CBAM. If I think about CBAM, a picture comes to my mind of a comic with a person entering a fight with text balloon exclamating CBAM. And I guess this is also how CBAM is perceived by some, as the EU installing a new penalty on imports from other countries. But is it really a punch in the face, or is it rather a legitimate way to make polluters pay? In any case, I certainly hope that today's debate will be lively. So what is this CBAM, or Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism in full? CBAM is one of the policy measures proposed by the European Commission as part of the Fit for 55 package, which is meant to put the EU on track to meet its goal of reducing its emissions by 55% in 2030. And it's currently in the final stages of negotiations between the European Parliament and the Council, where the member states sit, with the Commission watching whether its original proposal is kept as much as possible. CBAM is a levy on EU imports of certain carbon-heavy products, such as iron and steel. It will make polluters from other countries pay for their emissions if they want to export their products to the EU. The innovative mechanism is still under development, and as I mentioned, its details are now being negotiated between the Council and the Parliament, and there will also be a pilot phase in its beginning. But ever since its announcement, it has attracted a lot of attention and responses from the EU's trading partners. Some countries, like for instance India, have labeled CBAM as unilateral and discriminatory. Others, like Canada, are more positive and see it as an important step to reduce carbon emissions. So, is CBAM a form of environmental protectionism? And can Europe avoid trade wars over climate policy? We are about to find out in our debate. But first, I would like to introduce our two moderators of today, which are my colleagues Rem Korteweg and Julia Kretti. Rem Korteweg is the head of our outreach program at Clingendael and also a senior research fellow working mainly on trade and geopolitics. And he's also our Brexit expert. Julia Kretti is working as a research fellow at the Clingendael Institute, and she is mainly focusing on this external dimension of the Green Deal. And if you want to know who really in our institute knows the details about CBAM, then go to Julia. Well, Rem and Julia, I'm happy to hand over the floor to you, and I'm really looking forward to the debate. Please.
Thank you so much, Louise. And it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this online debate on can Europe avoid trade wars over climate policy? Now, you've eloquently outlined why this is a relevant question. And after lengthy negotiations, CBAM is almost done internally. And then it will go into the world. And how the rest of the world responds to CBAM will be critical to its success or its failure. And so that is why we today will focus on the way in which the EU's trading partners view CBAM. What will be the trade effects of the carbon border adjustment mechanism? Should certain countries be exempted from having to pay a carbon levy? And if so, why? And how to ensure that CBAM is compatible with international trade law? These are just some of the questions we will be debating today, because this is very much a debate. And we have a fantastic mix of speakers from the EU, its member states, and from the EU's trading partners with us here today. And let me very briefly mention them. First of all, we have David Boublil, who is Deputy Head of Unit of DG TAXUD at the European Commission, a critical linchpin in the implementation of CBAM. Then we have Pierre Leturcq, who is Director of Studies at the Europe Jacques Delors Institute and a real expert on CBAM. Then from Indonesia, but joining us from Rome today, is Dandi Rafitrandi, who is a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. We also have with us Susanne Dröge, who is Head of Department Climate Protection and Energy at the German Environment Agency, also known as the Umweltbundesamt. And then Lauren Stowe is joining us from Washington, D.C. Good morning to Lauren. She is a Senior Climate Policy Advisor at the Silverado Policy Accelerator. From Geneva, joining us is Carolyn Birkbeck, who's Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment, and SDGs. And last but not least, a research associate of ours at the Clingendael Institute, Pieter Pauw. Now, without much further ado, let me just very briefly walk you through what we're going to be doing today. We will debate 4 statements, each discussed by 3 experts. They will each get 2.5 minutes to offer their perspective on the statement, followed by a 1-minute rebuttal. In the meantime, we will ask you, the audience, to fill in a poll. After the debate, we have time for a couple of questions during the Q&A that Julia will moderate before we move on to the next statement. Also, let me also remind everyone that everything is on the record. So without much further ado, let's get started with our first statement. CBAM is a form of environmental protectionism. Is CBAM a trade measure that makes it more difficult for others to trade with the EU, thereby favoring domestic European industries? And is it therefore a quasi-protectionist instrument or not? How do others see CBAM? Pierre Leturcq, over to you first.
Thank you very much, Rem. I'd like to make 3 points very quickly. The first one is that CBAM has become a necessary instrument in the context of the Green Deal and the subsequent revision of the European trading scheme. The industries covered by the mechanism account for over 25% of global GHG emissions. So we cannot hope to reach climate neutrality without accelerating the decarbonization of these sectors. Hence, the need for a stronger CO2 price signal in the EU, which concretely means phasing out free allowances that these sectors are still receiving in the ETS, and that gradually. So it is part of a shift in the EU strategy to incentivize industrial decarbonization. Phasing out of free allowances will generate additional revenues in the ETS, and by 2030, the steel sector, just to give an example, was expected to receive about 80 billion in free allowances. So these revenues will be targeted and will then fall in the ETS modernization and innovation funds. So in the end, instead of leveling the playing field based on a status quo of decarbonization, nobody's moving and we're preserving our competitiveness by reimbursing carbon costs. It will level the playing field, but by targeting financial support on low carbon investments to reduce the transition costs and preserve European industry's competitiveness in spite of this decarbonization pathway. Second point, it's a plan B. CBAM is only a second best option in the absence of globally agreed sectoral decarbonization pathways. So depending on how you see it, it can be perceived either as a tool to accompany the emergence of a comparative advantage for low carbon productions in the EU and elsewhere, or as a tool to counterbalance this competitive disadvantage that EU industries will face through the fact that the green premium is necessarily higher for the first movers. But even in this difficult position, the CBAM has already led to a form of climate stimulus with positive outcomes on international partners. Which leads me to my final point. CBAM is meant to disappear. It's an evanescent measure. The perspective to which we are looking is a diffusion of low carbon industrial processes around the world, since all the main economies have pledged to reach climate neutrality and have reaffirmed their commitment to trying to stick to 1.5 degree of global warming by the end of the century. So CBAM will disappear as other countries adopt industrial decarbonization legislations. Depending on how we use and how we mobilize CBAM revenues and how we present it with an environmental narrative, CBAM can be perceived not as a protectionist tool, but rather as a stimulus for industrial decarbonization cooperation. Thank you.
Perfect. And just within 2.5 minutes, let's very quickly go over to Lauren Stowe. From the US perspective, how is CBAM viewed?
Well, as to the question of whether or not CBAM is a form of protectionism, it really depends on how it's defined and designed. So as with any policy, you can design for protection or for environmental protection, or you can design to protect your market and protect your industry. And in this instance, the way that CBAM can be designed to not be a form of trade protectionism is to ensure that it's agnostic in terms of fiscal policy. So, for example, requiring that there be some form of leveling of the playing field on carbon emissions embedded, but not requiring one type of policy, like a carbon price that's economy-wide, for example, is the only measure, or a carbon price that's sector-specific as the only measure, or firm-specific as the only measure, but having some sort of room for different countries to create policies that best fit with different countries' legal systems and current landscapes for policymaking. It also needs to be emissions performance-based so that we're actually working our way out of a CBAM policy. If it's performance-based, then you are basing a tax, tariff, whatever it is, for a good crossing a border on its actual carbon intensity, and you're giving yourself an opportunity to encourage and enhance decreased carbon intensive industrial practices over time, which is, I think, the goal for everyone. The one other thing to add there is that you have to allow for price discovery. The way you incentivize continued decarbonization is to create an opportunity for the tax or tariff to decrease over time. And finally, support for low-income countries to leapfrog their industrial processes is critical and crucial to having a policy that decreases carbon emissions globally, which is in everyone's best interest. And I think I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And just in a follow-up question, has the perspective in the US on CBAM changed over the past 6 months? Perhaps 2 sentences, and then we'll hand it over to Carolyn.
I think we're seeing growing momentum in the US to embrace different concepts of a CBAM in both political parties. There is interest. We have bill proposals as well as public statements from senators on both sides of the aisle, which is a new something new here in the US, And we also have John Kerry, the US climate envoy, making comments ahead of the COP, essentially that if China doesn't come to the COP ready to deliver results, that the US and the EU are ready to move forward with policies, I think referencing most likely CBAMs.
Thank you. Carolyn, over to you. Is CBAM a form of environmental protectionism?
Great. Thank you, Rem, for the invitation to be here today. So we could spend many hours debating the details and legalities of whether or not CBAM is a form of environmental protectionism. But what I wanted to underline today is that perceptions matter in international diplomacy on trade and on climate. So many of the EU's trading partners, especially from developing countries, perceive CBAM quite differently from how it's understood in the European context. And this has implications for international cooperation on climate and also on trade. So in the past year, a range of WTO members have expressed concerns in a number of different WTO processes, the Committee on Market Access, the Council for Trade in Goods, and in the Committee on Trade and Environment. Countries raising questions are as diverse as Turkey, Armenia, Indonesia, Pakistan, South Africa, Brazil, Paraguay, China, Kazakhstan, India, Japan. I can go on. Key words that I hear from developing country delegations in relation to CBAM are unilateral, protecting EU industry, environment being used to disguise protectionism, unnecessary barriers to trade, market distortion, poor transparency of legislative process, poor consultation, doesn't reflect CBDR or the idea of nationally determined contributions. It's ineffective in terms of its impact on carbon emissions, unfair sharing of responsibilities from developed to developing countries, and undermining trust. Now, whether or not one disagrees with these concepts, agrees or disagrees with these perceptions, the reality is that these views have traction among many countries with whom the EU is trying to cooperate, both on the climate front and the trade front. So we need to take them seriously. A second point is that to understand reactions to CBAM, we need to see that CBAM is not viewed as a standalone issue, but linked to a wider context. So it's become a proxy for concerns about climate justice and also trade justice. On the climate front, many developing countries are heavily dependent on exports that are GHG intensive and are not yet competitive in low carbon trade. For many of those countries, the clean energy transition is a massive challenge and they don't have the level of investment or fiscal space. There's also this issue of trade justice in the context of the failure in the WTO to address many of the critical concerns for developing countries on the trade front, and in particular, the sort of issues arising from the COVID crisis and the debt crisis that many of themselves find themselves in. So we also have to see that CBAM is not viewed alone. It's viewed in the context of measures that are also being taken by other countries, and that developing countries fear that CBAM-like initiatives will be exposed to more and more sectors. I have to stop because the thing being, so I'll stop.
But thank you very much, Carolyn. Yeah, and I apologize for the harsh cutoff. But we will now have the ability to entertain 1-minute responses from the speakers. So let me go back to Pierre and to see what points you either want to respond to that Lauren and Caroline mentioned, or perhaps you have another argument up your sleeve with respect to the statement that CBAM is a form of environmental protectionism, which I think, if I understand you correctly, you do not agree with.
No, I do not agree with, but I totally agree that perceptions matter, and that for that the EU needs to be more proactive in how it engages with, especially with developing countries, on how CBAM will impact them, and on the narrative that underpins CBAM's implementation. And I think it's critical that we present CBAM not only as a single and as a unique legislation, but to accompany CBAM with a range of other measures, which means that a form of climate diplomacy is needed around CBAM, a form of proactivity is needed around how we will mobilize the revenues to actually target investments in LDCs or in developing countries which need to scale up their capacity to invest in low carbon technologies. And well, it's the galaxy of measures that are around CBAM that matter in that sense. And for the moment, it's a bit lacking on the side of the European Union, I must admit.
Thank you very much. Lauren, over to you.
Yeah, I think I agree with that perception really matters. And I think the rubber has to meet the road with how we design things. So policies that just exempt least developed countries and say, you don't have to play in this sandbox, let wealthy countries off the hook. So the countries that are importing carbon intensive goods need to engage across the board. And so I would say that countering that perception is about ensuring that low income countries are specifically supported in being able to quickly decarbonize their industrial sectors. And trade is a really important component of that, to get the right technologies into developing countries and into low-income countries. So it's a basket of policy ideas that have to work in concert to address all of the issues.
Thanks, Lauren. And I'm sure with the next statements, we're absolutely going to cover a little bit dynamic with LDCs. Carolyn, back to you.
Sure. Thanks. So look, the last point I was going to make is that these perceptions, and it really echoes Pierre's point, just really underline the case for more dialogue on these sorts of trade-related climate measures, more transparency in their design, more consultation with other governments around their implementation, to show that we carefully consider and address the impacts on trading partners, and especially the challenges facing developing countries, and to really show, which I think is true, that the EU is committed to being a partner with countries on climate change, but we need to do more to have a narrative about this, and to think of ways that we can better understand and address developing countries' concerns about policies like CBAM. One thing we can do is to think harder about what kind of principles and best practices should underpin the design of such measures, and to help legislators also to understand some of the concerns of trading partners. And the key thing for me is, developing countries also want to thrive in this decarbonized global economy. And so we have to make sure that we are actively looking for ways to help them to do so.
Thank you very much. So I think we can sort of agree that perceptions matter and that they should be taken into consideration. Julia, do we have any questions from the participants?
Of course. So first of all, I would like to present the result of the poll. It seems that our audience is exactly divided on this topic. Half thinks that CBAM is indeed a form of protectionism, while the other half agrees with the position of the speakers that perhaps is more of a measure to level the playing field. So thank you very much for expressing your opinion, and I would like to encourage all of you to pose your question via the Q&A function. And I would like to pick one question from the audience, which is about this problem of this perception that was raised by many of you, and the fact that CBAM is often perceived as a unilateral move aimed at protecting EU companies. So the question is, what can be done to avoid this impression? Of course, you already mentioned a few options, but if you could pick only one, which advice would you give to the EU to make sure that this impression is avoided? Perhaps we can start from Carolyn. You have 1 minute.
Oh, gosh, I think I already said it. I would consultation, consultation, and consultation.
Thank you. Lauren?
I would say there's just got to be agnostic on fiscal tools. If we're going to demand that other countries and trading partners are taking steps to try to decarbonize domestically, we have to let them use all of the tools in their toolbox and not just the ones that we perceive or one country perceives as the right tool.
Thank you. And finally, Pierre, over to you.
I would say two things. The first is mobilizing resources, and for that meeting our own pledges on international climate finance. That's the first one. And the second one is moving forward on this idea of creating a plurilateral environment for harmonizing industrial decarbonization policies and bringing more transparency on how they are designed and how they are impacting trade, and especially trade with the developing with global south countries. So the idea of the climate club is interesting, but that should be more open, more inclusive, and really open and transparent in the way that it's going to be designed.
Of course, thank you very much. All very useful advices. I would like to ask another question from the audience. What do you think? Could CBAM fuel global tensions? Very interesting question. So maybe Caroline?
Sure. Look, I think it already is fueling global tensions. I mean, we have a statement at COP27 from Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, 4 of the largest emerging economies, and they issued a joint statement saying that unilateral measures and discriminatory practice such as carbon border taxes result in market distortion and critically aggravate the trust deficit among parties. So, I mean, I think that they're already saying that this is undermining, their view that they can have a cooperative conversation on these topics. So we need them to be actors and partners in climate action. We're not going to solve the problem without them. So I think that this is a really central central thing to be addressed.
Of course, very good point. Thank you very much. And now, Lauren, over to you.
They certainly can fuel tensions depending on, what is asked of people. And in order to keep competition healthy and strong, there's got to be transparent data that's provided in a balance with protecting business confidential information. We can't be asking companies to put forward their secret recipes for how they're doing things, and then expect them to be willing to continue to trade and, lose their competitive edge. So we have to strike the right balance, but hopefully we can do that.
Exactly, that's probably the challenging part. And now, Pierre, you have the last word.
So yeah, of course, it's reinforcing the tensions, but the problem is that CBAM is not the only tool which at the moment is causing more tensions. If you look at the IRA, it's not even comparable with how incompatible with WTO law it is when you compare it to CBAM. There are so many other tools that we should discuss, and CBAM is just one of these examples of how the world is shifting towards more indeed unilateral measures to actually level the playing field when we invest in low carbon technologies. But I would say that it's just one part of a global crisis of mistrust in the international community, which is not only led and driven by CBAM.
And on this point, you're the first, Pierre, to bring up the WTO. And one area where you might expect a final decision on whether CBAM is environmental protectionism or not is at the WTO. I know that neither of you three have a crystal ball, but given that you think about this issue a lot and speak to people that are working on this issue, would you expect a WTO challenge to CBAM at some point? Pierre, perhaps you first.
Yes, a challenge, of course. I think it's pretty previsible, but being ruled against by the WTO appellate body, that I very much doubt it. I think it's pretty solid at the moment. If the Commission and the Parliament and the Council agree on what's currently on the table, I think it matches both GATT Article 3.4 or it could fall under the exception of GATT Article 20. So I think it's pretty solid.
Lauren, what is the thinking on the other side of the Atlantic on a WTO challenge?
I agree that a challenge is likely, but I think any action or finding against a CBAM is very unlikely. And I would say that there's plenty of room to design a CBAM that is very compatible with Article 20 and the GATT and the rules of the WTO. There's also a huge need to address this massive amount of carbon leakage that is occurring, in part because countries have different timelines. And there's a good reason why countries have different timelines. And we have to figure out how to make that not delay the decrease in massive carbon emissions. And there's such a need for action in trade policy, and not a lot that looks promising on the immediate term horizon in the WTO, that hopefully that can become a place where there is more of, as Carolyn references, conversation. Maybe that's a space where we can get to incrementally more global agreement about how to manage this trade-based carbon leakage.
And Carolyn, consultation, conversation, but also perhaps litigation?
Look, I think it's realistic to expect a challenge. But I think that what we should really be focusing our attention on is what are the pathways forward for international cooperation on these topics. And I think, as Pierre has also underlined, I mean, the EU is working on multiple fronts, many of which, you know, it's made a big effort. It led the charge on loss and damage at the climate conference, or not lost the charge, at least. It was first major developed countries to come to the table finally on that. So, I mean, I think there's scope for building trust. We will see trade-related climate measures. So I think the key thing is that we try and build cooperation around those. And one of the things we're going to have to do is better connect the dots between things like climate finance, trade diplomacy, and also wider development diplomacy. And just to last thing of good news, I think the EU is really working hard to build this kind of cooperation. I know that they are working with Kenya and Ecuador and New Zealand to build a coalition of trade ministers that will be inclusive, exactly to tackle these kinds of problems, you know, looking to build a coalition that involves least developed countries, vulnerable countries, and a range of sort of mid-level developing countries. And that's really going to be vital, because all of these issues will require, you know, they're complex. There are a lot of tensions and competitive issues at stake, but we'll only resolve those by coming together and discussing them.
Thanks so much. Thanks to Pierre, Carolyn, and Lauren for kicking us off and for debating this first statement. You've given the others an example of what to do, so I'm very much looking forward to our next group. We may hear from you a little bit later on, but let's transition to our second statement. So CBAM revenues should not flow into the EU budget. CBAM, the carbon levy, will generate revenue as exporters pay the CBAM levy at the EU's customs border. But what should happen with those funds? Phrased cynically, is CBAM another cash machine for the European Union? Or are there things we should be doing otherwise with these funds? To debate these statements, we've invited Susanne, Dandy, and David to offer their interventions. Susanne, over to you first.
Well, yes, thanks a lot. So I have bad news, because we're not free to choose what to do with the CBAM anymore. When it comes to the decision by heads of state and government, the decision has been taken in 2020 in summer. I guess not the last decision maybe, but the general idea was to make it the cash cow in the lights of the corona crisis and the recovery from the pandemic. But more from a general point of view, I think the use should definitely be devoted to investments in climate protection within the EU and outside. I have a clear view that it should not be framed as a fiscal tool, because this is very damaging to the image, and it is a trap because it involves the finance ministers who really don't want to see something decline. And the CBAM, as by definition, as we heard before, the revenues will have to dry up if the tool is supposed to be successful. The other point is that this is part of an industrial policy for sure, because decarbonization within the EU needs to take place, and it's part of foreign policy and development policy and decarbonization abroad. So I think revenue recycling with a regular review could be a good way forward in order to help developing countries that are especially export dependent on particular parts of the industries that are covered by the CBAM, because it's not a one-size-fits-all tool, but it has definitely a framing that it is a tool for specific countries and the trade flows from them. Sorry, I cannot see the clock anymore. My phone here has turned black, so I need a clear signal. Okay, so, and I think, so in order to make sense out of the revenue recycling, we need some kind of international transparency about the financial flows and their actual dimension. And I think it needs to be regularly revised and be part of the dialogues that had been mentioned before in order to reach out to key trade partners.
Thank you very much, Susanne. Right on the clock. And I think one of the points you made is also that the issue of CBAM's revenues is still a matter of what we want to use it for, whether for domestic purposes or perhaps it might flow back to developing countries in the form of developing aid. In that light, very interested to bring Dundee into the conversation. Dundee, where do you stand?
Right. Thank you very much for having me and for the very insightful discussion so far. From the standpoint of developing countries, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, the revenue should be redirected to fund decarbonization in LDCs. Although I'm pretty sure that the political economy, conflicting interests within the EU will be far more complicated. But from the literature, I think we can safely say that that the potential adverse impact of the CBAM will be bigger for the least developed countries because of their lack of capacity to decarbonize their economies. One projection from the UNCTAD in 2022 stated that 1% reduction in demand in the sector deemed carbon intensive leads a slight decline in GDP in 21 countries, which group as least developed countries. Thus, the revenue, I think, could contribute to narrowing the climate financing gaps and fund programs that build the country's abilities. For example, the renewable energy sectors, encourage low carbon options, and help them build their own green industries. I think this will be a great incentive for the least developed countries to meet their climate goals. I think one point that is also crucial is the transition period for the EU to really engage and cooperate with LDCs and developing countries to discuss and operationalize and discuss the mechanism if the CBAM will be taken. In this case, I think it can also be viewed as a strategic investment in the EU's future green and energy security in response to the ongoing war in the Ukraine. I think my last point will be echoing the previous panel that perception matters. I think from the EU's perspective, allocating the revenue for the LDCs will likely increase the CBAM acceptance, in particular among WTO member countries, and change the protectionist policy narratives. Well, hopefully this is will also reduce the possibility of retaliation from other countries. Yeah, given the current WTO condition, I think we should avoid this further geopolitical friction at all costs. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you also for pointing out the broader geopolitical context in which CBAM is taking shape. Over to you now, David, and you more than anyone on this in this event know more about the financial details of CBAM. Could you bring us up to speed about where the EU discussion now stands, whether the revenues should flow into the general EU budget, should flow back to companies in the form of export rebates, should be used for stimulating decarbonization in LDCs? What do you make of it?
Okay, well, first I need to react to your provocative statement that it would be a cash machine for the EU. Obviously, CBAM is not and cannot be a cash machine for a number of reasons. First, because, well, most of the revenue from CBAM is not from CBAM, is from the ETS, is from getting rid of free allocation in the ETS, and most of these revenues go to member states and then are given back to the industry through the innovation and modernization fund. Second, I confirm, as Susan said, that the decision of where the revenue should flow has been taken 2 years ago in December at the highest level by the Council, by the European Parliament, and by the Commission, to say that the revenues of CBAM should be part of the new own resources to refund the loan under the next generation EU. So the decision was taken 2 years ago. Then if this decision had not been taken, there's a number of reasons why it makes sense to have CBAM at EU level. First is that climate policy is something that climate is something that affects the whole planet, and taking action at the highest possible level is appropriate to address questions of climate. The second is that CBAM will be enforced at the border, but for the entirety of the single market. So having CBAM going to member states rather than to the EU does not reflect this reality. I understand why the Netherlands, with its big ports, would want that. But still, from a single market perspective, it makes sense to have it at EU level. And the last thing is that the Commission had proposed CBAM to be enforced by member states, and both Council and Parliament want CBAM to be enforced by the Commission. And from there, it is another reason to justify that the revenues would be levied at EU level.
Okay, thank you very much, David. And we'll get back to the question of whether it should fund decarbonization initiatives or help on the export rebate side, perhaps a little bit later on. Let me now return to Susanne and ask if there are any points you want to raise in rebuttal or based on the comments that you've heard from Dundee and David.
Yes, thanks. I think I also wanted to say something about this export rebate thing. And I mean, given the WTO rules, that's the worst of all ideas. Maybe I can just reply on what I heard from Dundee. It's like we want to do two things. We want to do that. We want to have a leveling playing field. So I think it's important to find ways to provide money for trade partners to decarbonize, for poor trade partners. I think that fits very well in what we've heard before. And that will bring down the Q in the equation. So the quantity of emissions imported, and will take out the pressure in terms of costs. And the other way to do it is bringing down the P. That means the price that's actually being charged. We can credit at the border for a foreign carbon pricing. That would be a way forward, also a little bit more mid to long term, to help countries on that end. And the revenues, of course, need to be split up in a way that makes sense on both ends. I'm not in support of using that directly as an export rebate. That's legally a hierarchy way of doing it.
Okay, thank you. And while the clock runs to zero, I think I think your point on the export rebate is a very valid one, and it'll be interesting to see what comes out of the trilogue, because of course this was agreed by the European Parliament to add the export rebate. I'd be interested to also hear David's views on this in a minute, but not before we've heard from Dundee.
Right. So I think it's very interesting because we know that the CBAM as a climate stick, right? And for developing countries, it will be very ideal way to channel the revenue in any ways, in terms of having a cooperation platforms as the carrots. So we have both the stick and also the carrots. And I think the EU already has several platforms such as international cooperation, trade agreements, and other initiatives as a leverage. And also the last point that I would like to make, that probably as the first mover in addressing this carbon leakage problem, it is very important for the EU to set a good precedent for other countries if they really want to make this kind of the CBAM like policy. So that's my point.
Yeah, thank you very much. And then over to you, David.
Okay, yes, thank you. Well, I think there are two points on which I need to react. The first is the support to least developed countries. Well, indeed, the Parliament has suggested that the revenues of CBAM should go to supporting least developed countries. The EU is already supporting decarbonization policies in least developed countries through many different instruments, including the Global Gateway, and we will continue doing so. And as I was saying, the CBAM revenue is expected to decrease quickly because of decarbonation, because of carbon prices paid abroad. So linking the support to least developed countries to the amount of revenue from CBAM is not necessarily in the interest of least developed countries. What matters is that they get on the pathway for decarbonation, and the EU is helping for that. On the question of export rebates, like Susanne, I think it's a very, very bad idea, because giving subsidies for exports is something that under WTO rules does not make sense, because it can be countervailed very easily and by trade partners. So what the EU is proposing, and well, what the Commission is proposing in terms of support for export in CBAM is the timeline of introduction. You will have noticed that the introduction of CBAM is very progressive, on the slow path, starting in 2026 to 2035. The second is to support for decarbonation in the Innovation Fund for the industries that are in the scope of CBAM. And the last thing is engagement with trade partners and engagement with partners around the world to favor decarbonation and eventually make CBAM redundant. So that's how we see the export side of CBAM, and not by using the revenue to give rebates.
Thank you very much for clarifying that, David. Julia, what is our audience keen to hear?
So our audience is split exactly equally also on this topic. And
Again?
Yes, we have a good diversity apparently. So half thinks that the revenue should flow into the EU budget, indeed, while the other half perhaps that they should be redirected to the least developed countries, as mentioned by our speakers. I would like now to pick two questions from our audience. So the first one is, how does the EU currently address CBAM communication with its trade partners? And linked to that, what are the most important forums to discuss CBAM? Is it the UNFCCC, so for instance via the COP27, or the WTO, or perhaps will the discussion more likely to happen bilaterally? I would like to give the floor first to Dandy. Please, you have 1 minute.
Right, thank you very much. I would like to address the second question first. I think UNFCCC COP will be a very great platform to discuss about this, the CBAM policy. But I think next year the G20 as well. I think it's also a good platform for countries to discuss about this. And also we know that India is one of the developing countries that has a very strong argument regarding the CBAM. So I think it will be very interesting to see the outcome for the G20 as well.
Thank you very much. And now, Susanne, over to you.
Yes, I would also refer to that question. I think for the EU, the most logical way forward is to talk bilaterally, as long as the scope of the CBAM is about 5 sectors roughly, in order to test the ground, in order to find where it's really needed, support is really needed. While at the same time, of course, this topic should be discussed in the WTO forums, which is already taking place. I would say that I wouldn't push it too much on the UNFCCC agenda, simply because it's a very technical issue for the time being. It's related to a lot of false, or let's say perception-driven discussions that take a lot of energy. While for the EU, from the EU point of view, it's really crucial to get this thing on the ground and understood, and the dimensions need to be sorted out in a very technical manner. That's why my order of my ranking would start with bilateral understanding on what we are talking about and how bilateral cooperation could work in order to decarbonize, because it's really at the moment a very narrow tool and we can all target the purpose of it very well at the moment.
Thank you very much, Susanne, for your stake. And now, last but not least, David, perhaps you can focus more on how the EU is currently communicating with its trade partners. Over to you.
Okay, I can do that. And I must say that all the forums that you've mentioned are relevant, because my Director General was in COP27, where we had an event on CBAM, which was very broadly attended. I have been presenting CBAM in at least 3 different WTO committees: the Committee on Trade in Goods, Trade and Environment, the Trade and Sustainable Dialogue. There's the OECD including forum on carbon mitigation approaches that also is looking into it. There's the climate club that is being set up by G7 that is looking into CBAM, and I know we'll be discussing this later today. In G20 last July in G20 Finance, there was a policy breakfast on carbon pricing where CBAM was raised, and we have plenty of bilateral meetings. I've been speaking to a great number of countries about CBAM, and there is a lot to be done, in particular with the countries with whom we trade the goods that are in the scope of CBAM, to find solutions and to come to approaches to do it in the way that favors decarbonation in the EU and in the country of origin of the goods.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating, but we have to move on to our third statement. But thank you very much to Susanne, David, and Dandi. Our third statement. Our third statement today reads: the EU should give exemptions to vulnerable countries most affected by CBAM. In a way, it's a continuation of our previous statement, but still slightly different. Should every country that does not have an equivalent system to the EU's emission trading scheme pay for CBAM? And if not, who should be exempted and why? And why would you give exemptions? Wouldn't this just undermine the functioning of CBAM in the first place and stimulate carbon leakage? To make sense of this statement, we're going to hear from Pieter Pauw, Carolyn, Birkbeck, and Pierre Leturcq. Pieter, over to you first.
Yes, thank you very much, Rem. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak here and to meet you all. I think judging from recent literature, I think CBAM can be made WTO compatible, but making exemptions is probably very difficult. But there's many details to this that I don't feel necessarily comfortable to address, because I'm not a lawyer here, and I do believe you have to be a lawyer here. But my point is a bit larger in a sense, and that is, even if CBAM is compatible with WTO regulations, or even if exemptions could be made, I think it should be avoided that CBAM further entrenches divisions between the global north and the global south. And I think other speakers have also already made that point one way or another, because such further entrenchment would negatively affect CBAM, the UN climate negotiations as a whole, and global cooperation in general. And I think it can be prevented, such entrenchment, by using these CBAM revenues to support developing countries that are impacted by CBAM. But then again, it needs to be very clearly thought about how to do this. And so, for example, the technical assistance that is often mentioned, it's important to help developing countries in dealing with CBAM regulations, but it's not a sign of generosity at all, because without CBAM, there wouldn't even be this support need, right? Another issue is loss and damage financing, which is a huge topic, which was a huge topic at the COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh just the other week. this should also not be mobilized through CBAM, right? Because CBAM financing, if you can call it that way, or sorry, loss and damage financing should be mobilized by the historical emitters and not by the poorer developing countries that themselves that export to the EU. So instead, I think in line with the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities under the UN climate negotiations, which is key here really. I think countries should only be supported with mitigating emissions through the revenues from CBAM. And this of course has a broader political value. So you show that CBAM is not only about trade, that it's not about trade. You show that it's not about protectionism, but that it's about climate change. And that's builds trust and creates buy-in. And then the question is, okay, in which of those most impacted countries, most impacted by CBAM, should be supported to mitigate emissions through the net revenues? And oh geez, time is up already. I have, and I think, okay.
Famous last words. Oh yay, time is up already. You'll have 1 minute after we've heard from Carolyn and Pierre. Carolyn, great to have you back. What's your view on the statement that the EU should give exemptions to vulnerable countries?
Great. Thank you, Ram. Just check. I'm off. Yes. Great. Look, I would agree with Pieter's point that, I mean, the core thing is to avoid CBAM becoming more of a source of tension than it already is, and to look for ways that we can bolster international cooperation. So I think here the real challenge is one of the real challenges is grappling with different approaches to climate policies and regulation, as I think Lauren also mentioned, that we need to be open to the fact that countries, may just take different approaches to their climate action. But I think the critical point, if I can turn the question around a bit, is how do we support developing countries and the most vulnerable in their low carbon transformation, and what do they need in order to be partners in climate action? And I think certainly what I hear from many developing countries is that they would like support to build and foster their own climate resilient and climate smart development. It's not only about low carbon transition, but it's about ensuring that their economies can develop in ways that enable them to be competitive and prosperous in this new low carbon economy. And here I think that the key challenge is that many countries are carbon intensive, as I said already, and many lack the fiscal space and resources to drive this transformation alone. So issues of financing are absolutely central. We need more efforts to help them develop and take up clean production technologies to support their energy transition. There's work to be done around technical assistance on data gathering and measurement related to carbon footprints and disclosure. There's technology transfer needed, and we would need to do much more to spur private sector investment in these economies. So less than 2% of private climate finance goes to least developed countries, for instance. We also need to recognize that we're not talking about least developed countries alone. There are many, many countries that sit between China and LDCs, and all of these can be partners in decarbonisation. But my advice is that we look more around some of the sectoral decarbonisation initiatives and how we can build international cooperation around key hard to abate sectors. We look at some of the issues like trade-related transportation emissions, things like how we can promote the development and uptake of climate-friendly technologies, how we tackle issues like subsidies. There's a whole set of other issues that warrant international cooperation and which would benefit from working together.
Thank you. I take away from that CBAM isn't necessarily not the only tool, but perhaps not just the right tool either to stimulate climate mitigation and climate cooperation. Final speaker in this round is Pierre Leturcq.
Thank you, Rem. This time I'd like to make 2 points. The first one is legal. The second one is more diplomatical, geopolitical. First, I think it could be justifiable in the WTO laws to grant exemptions to least developed countries, for instance. I think there are sufficient legal grounds in the international public law to consider that an exemption for LDCs would be legitimate and legal. I will not enter into detail, but that justification could be built upon the special and differentiated treatment regime under the WTO, or, of course, the common but differential responsibilities principle recalled by the Paris Agreement. To give just a few examples of what already exists in European measures going in this direction, you've got the everything but arms regime or the general scheme of preferences. So things could be possible in this way. My second point would be that it would bring about more complexity. And is it really what LDCs, for instance, are asking for? But that's very much echoing what Caroline already has said. So the first thing is, under which criteria would you exclude some countries? Is it based on climate vulnerability, or is it based on belonging to a certain category of countries under the WTO, for instance, being recognized as an LDC or as a developing countries? So that's pretty much uncertain. And the thing that is very much certain, on the contrary, is that if the EU is to decide unilaterally and arbitrarily on which country are going to be exempted or not, depending on its own categories and conditions, that would be very much WTO incompatible. So my take would be that sending that message to LDCs would be a bit puzzling. So instead of exempting them, what we have put on the table is rather helping them, creating new financing schemes to help LDCs industries scale up their emission monitoring and reporting capacities. So the biggest issue, I think, for the acceptance of CBAM by Global South countries is not really to be exempted, but it's more how CBAM proceeds will be used and how CBAM will actually generate a momentum for further international cooperation on industrial decarbonization. And I think COP27 has already showed that resource mobilization is really the prerequisite to any form of climate progress at the moment. And when you know the latest estimates that over 2,000 billion of investment will be required to adapt to climate change in Global South countries, I think here there are more efforts to make in this direction than on exemptions.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Resource mobilization is key. I give it back to Pieter, who's also been avidly watching the whole question of climate financing. And you now have a minute to either finish your initial comments or respond to any points that you've heard from Pierre or Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you. I will finish my story. So my point that I wanted to make additionally was that it needs to be tailor-made. How do you use the revenues to support countries impacted by CBAM? And then, a couple of countries definitely don't need those revenues. So there's a couple of Annex 1 countries that are heavily impacted. So developed countries under the convention, Ukraine, Russia, USA, Turkey, these should not be receiving the revenues. Then there's others that have higher per capita emissions than the EU. And they have a responsibility to mitigate independently. So that would be China, South Korea, United Arab Emirates. And then there's another group of highly exposed countries, according to some of the research I've seen, at least, that might be better off in joining the ETS rather than to deal with CBAM, right? So these are EU candidates such as North Macedonia, Serbia, Albania, or potential candidate countries such as Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Georgia. And so, that already reduces, I think, the number of countries that you really should point your revenues to. And among the most impacted are, of course, then Mozambique and South Africa and Morocco. But even there, you have to very carefully think and probably discuss bilaterally how to use the revenues best. So, I mean, with South Africa, there is already this just energy transition investment plan that the EU is also supporting, and Morocco, of course, is a neighboring country of the EU. So that's again very different. So yeah, I'd like to keep it there.
Thank you very much. And smoothly transiting to Carolyn.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think that we have a pretty good view on this panel that CBAM, we can't make CBAM do everything. We have a sense that CBAM should involve more consultation and discussion with trading partners, and that's critical because of the perceptions that there are around it, and that shapes the context for climate cooperation and cooperation on many other critical issues on the climate trade interface. So I think we've heard today that there are also other issues. We can't let CBAM and the debate around CBAM swamp the space for all of these other concerns. And I raise that because I think for LDCs, some do have some specific concerns about CBAM, but their concerns are not limited to CBAM. If the European Parliament and European policymakers and NGOs and think tanks want to talk about LDCs, trade and climate, there are many other issues that LDCs would put on the agenda, such as around climate finance, trade finance, the trade issues arising that they face due to climate shocks and natural disasters, their need for financing for an energy transition and trade policy context that supports that and so on. So I think we shouldn't diminish the issues that LDCs face to just being looking at this through that lens of CBAM. And we also shouldn't only look at developing countries in the context of CBAM as though LDCs were the only ones that were touched. There's a broad range of developing countries that are touched as well that we need to, and that's why we have to go more in the consultation and discussion side around this as well.
Thank you. Pierre?
Yeah, perhaps just one remark to say that we are often referring to Mozambique to justify that kind of measure or exempting developing countries. The thing is that in Mozambique, yes, so 87% of Mozambique's aluminium is sent to the EU. So it's very dependent on access to EU market. The problem is that the only big smelter in Mozambique is owned by BHP, which is an Australian global company. So I doubt that here there would be any kind of problem to adapt to the legislation that the EU is currently putting into place. So I think it should be a case-by-case assessment, and that's what makes the thing very difficult, is that if you take a country-based method and assessment, then it becomes tricky when you know that part of the plants that are operating in these countries are actually led and operated by global companies. So that's why I think we should be a bit careful about all these questions of exemptions and rather push on the diplomatic and cooperation side of things.
Thank you. Julia, what's the result of the poll and what have our audience been?
The result is still very divided. We have a 48% in favor of the exemptions and 52% against. So I think this clearly shows how controversial this topic still is and how different the perception is among different stakeholders, perhaps from different countries. Would be interesting to see a follow-up of this poll. And now I would like to pick a question from the public. And about this issue of trade conflict. So in case countries decide to retaliate, how would this countermeasure look like? So what would a trade conflict look like in this scenario? Perhaps we can start with Pieter.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a very difficult question, actually. I wouldn't really know. I mean, the hope, of course, is that other countries would set up similar systems. But I'm not sure if that's going to be the case. So I'd better pass on the question to the other panelists here.
All right, fair enough. Then I would like to ask Carolyn, please. Carolyn, you're still muted. Can you hear us?
Yes. Sorry. I'm sorry. Would you mind repeating the question?
Of course. So in the scenario of a trade conflict within the framework of CBAM, what kind of countermeasure could countries actually put in place?
Oh, I'm also going to pass on that.
Let's see if we have better luck with our last speaker. Pierre, do you have any idea, any suggestion?
I mean, the question is interesting, but who would give the weapons to, duties, subsidies? There are many forms of countervailing duties that you could think about to kind of counter CBAM, but I don't think that's really the moment to try and anticipate that kind of thing.
Yeah, hopefully diplomacy will get there before and we can avoid this terrible scenario.
Unfortunately, this means we now have to go to our final statement. But thank you very much to Pieter, Pierre, and Carolyn. Our final statement reads, CBAM will only work if it is part of a climate club. Now, obviously, this depends on what you define as a climate club and what you define as work. But this suggestion has been part of Germany's G7 proposal. The idea being that if others join CBAM, all the better. But how could this work in practice? And is it a necessary precondition for the EU to get international acceptance of its carbon levy? In other words, is Climate Club part of the answer to making CBAM an effective tool? And to make sense of this, we have Susanne, Lauren, and David. Susanne, over to you first.
Yeah. Well, the simple answer is no. Why no? Because this original proposal that is 2 years old was a very narrow one, the German Climate Club proposal. It was targeting carbon pricing, and the idea was a Nordhaus-style club that somewhat triggers cooperation through the stick, not the carrot. This proposal is in total flux. It is not that the G7 has already established this kind of club. It's in a working group that is supposed to deliver end of this year. We will see what's going to happen. And it has several ingredients. And one ingredient has evolved as a club idea that seems to be the pragmatic way forward, that is bilateral cooperation on particular decarbonization projects, in particular the things that are called JETPs, just energy transition partnerships. Mm-hmm. So the CBAM as such is not a club good that could fly within the G7, but that's not a surprise at all. We know that with the Inflation Reduction Act that the US is not in for carbon pricing. It's rather negative carbon pricing that's in the IRA. So I think this discussion is moving on both ends. It's evolving as something the German cooperation model is now being adjusted over time. The G7, I guess, will probably come up with something that's more focused on industry decarbonization, so a sector agreement of whatever type. It depends very much on what's going to happen in industrial policy approaches towards the energy and climate transition. So after all, I think I regard it in the meantime as a detached thing. The CBAM is a new EU project, and we heard a lot about how it could evolve also in bilateral cooperation. Thank you.
But just we still have a little bit of time. What I wonder is if climate clubs are not essential to get CBAM to work, CBAM remains a unilateral effort. Is it then just left to, say, the Brussels effect to ensure that other countries are on board, or is there a multilateral element that should be part of the EU's broader international outreach regarding CBAM?
Well, you know, the issue I have with this, and if you ask me as an expert, I would say it's always a problem to align other countries. If the EU aligns on this as a tool to put pressure on countries to join a club, we are back to the discussion we had before, right? Is it protectionist? Is it kind of not in line with the CBDRC? Or is it's something that will not fly with the US or other G7 countries? So taking out this particular issue, political issue, is key to me. And that is why I feel that it's not about the EU acting unilaterally. It cannot, but it's going to do that if it implements the CBAM either way, because it's already on track of implementation. And if this is supposed to be prepared with a club, this will take many, many more years. So, I mean, either way, the EU is moving forward alone at this point in time.
Thank you very much. Quickly over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, I think I don't see EU ahead of the letter CBAM in this statement. And so I would take a slightly broader view on this and think about carbon border adjustment mechanisms as a tool to address and end consumption-based carbon leakage because of traded goods. And in that perspective, I think absolutely a climate club or something, if you define climate club as collaboration amongst countries is a necessary piece of the recipe. However, I would agree that it's incremental. So first, a climate club could take many forms. It could be similar to what's happening in the G7. I understand Japan is very motivated to try to move that forward next year, but we'll see. It could be something that comes out of conversations in the WTO. It could very well be something that grows out of unilateral action taken by the EU, taken by the US, taken by others possibly, that grows into more plurilateral or bilateral action. Second point I would make is that carbon border adjustments, in order to be effective, they have to be able to address supply chain reshuffling, which implies in and of itself that multiple markets are participating. And they have to be able to address the highest emitters when it comes to industrial manufacturing. And that is an aspect that in Washington, there's a lot of motivation and traction to be sure to address that. And that means that countries cannot have carbon intensive production for domestic consumption and then carbon efficient production for export markets. And that's something that likely a climate club or a group of countries would need to agree to utilize a metric for a tariff or a tax that addresses just that and doesn't enable countries to maintain very high emissions for their domestic consumption of industrial use, but really starts to transition globally. The last thing, just to come back around to it, is that this is an incremental process. So we're seeing bilateral sectoral conversations like the US-EU Global Arrangement on Steel conversations. We're seeing unilateral proposals like the EU CBAM. There are multiple draft legislations in the United States as well. And I expect there will be more in the new Congress next year. And we'll see where we go multilaterally.
Thank you very much for that, Lauren. And last but not least, back to you, David.
Thank you. I will answer your question by another question. Is it better to address climate change and to mitigate climate change at global level, or is it better to do it in isolation at the level of a country, of a regional ensemble? And there, I think we could all agree that if we had a solution that could be applied at global level, we'd be very happy about that, and it would work better. But this will take time, and we're facing a climate emergency. So we need to have instruments that enable players at the level to reach their targets and to contribute to climate change mitigation. And that's what CBAM is for. CBAM is to reinforce the EU policy to decarbonize. CBAM has been designed to be open to other policies, to be open to articulation with other policies, because it is based on an actual embedded emissions methodology. It allows deduction of a carbon price paid in the country of origin, and it allows agreements. So it will in any case take into account of the effects in policies in other countries. Then can a climate club help working together on having instruments in different countries that work better together, because we're using the same methodologies, because we're using the same metrics, because we focus on the same products? Yes, it can. Is the term club the best chosen term? Possibly not. But do we need to work together with partners? We absolutely need to work together. So we need CBAM for ourselves, and we need a club to speak to the rest of the world. That's how I would put it.
Thank you very much. And just to follow up, when you say there is an obvious need or interest to engage in conversations to establish metrics, are we already having those conversations, and how difficult are they? I mean, I could imagine that establishing a consensus view on measuring the carbon content of a ton of steel isn't very straightforward.
Well, we are having this conversation in a number of forums and bilateral discussions, with the US, but also with others. And what we need in the EU is to have something which reflects what we have in the context of the ETS. And so the challenge that we have is to have an international methodology that is consistent with our own approach, which is about measuring the emissions at the level of an industrial site. And obviously industrial sites do not travel. So what we're doing right now in CBAM is trying to translate metrics of emissions at a site into metrics within a ton of steel. We're doing that, and we're trying to do that based on methods and approaches that are internationally recognized, so that it can be compatible with the approaches of our partners. But indeed, this involves discussions, and that's why, again, the idea of a club is something that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you very much. Now for rebuttals or add-ons, Susanne, over to you.
Yes, many thanks. I just wanted to mention the OECD efforts to get these metrics right. I also feel that this is a key issue that has been mentioned. And I think in the overlap with the trade discussions, we are here at a turning point when it comes to define processes and production methods that are not recognizable in the product. So I think this whole debate is pushing a lot the limits of the current non-discrimination rules. We won't see any moves there on such of substance, but never mind. It's important for trade partners to realize from the trade policy point of view that things are starting to move on. I just wanted to comment that, of course, there are two questions here in this question number 4. The one is, what is the CBAM about? Is it a threat or not? And so is a club a good idea? And I think, of course, a club is a good idea if you fill it with the right club good. But my point really was that for the time being, I do not see that the CBAM is needing the club, while the other way around, I feel the same. So it could work separately and go on in different directions. And at some point, they will probably meet again. But given that we are in this situation that the EU as a front runner still needs to do something about the exported emissions, so in terms of imported embedded emissions, it's really in kind of paradox and a trap when it comes to leveling the interest, that it's not confrontational with a sanction at the border, and at the same time it's trying to move forward with this commitment and the NDC. So this is the kind of political and foreign policy trap. In order to communicate this, it's really a thin line to walk, and we've come across this in the other questions.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, for a CBAM to achieve its goals, it needs something of a club to evolve. It needs to be able to evolve into something of a club or a collaborative approach. I think we're saying similar things. There also needs to be a first mover. That could be the EU, that could be the US, that could be any country, but that's how we move forward incrementally. But this question of interoperability of metrics is really important. And the EU's emissions trading system, for example, if you compare the value applied to 1 ton of steel produced exactly the same way in the EU ETS and the California ETS, you get assigned a completely different number. So in the EU, it's about 1 ton CO2 equivalent. And in the California system, it's about 3.8 tons CO2 equivalent. So we have to have some sort of common agreement, which is why I would say that just having, for example, in the EU CBAM approach, that just acknowledging a carbon price, if any country has a carbon price, and treating that all equally, not that the EU will choose to treat that all equally because it's much more complex than that. But oftentimes in conversations here in the US, that is sort of the impression that people have. So back on impressions matter. We have to make sure that the metrics that we're using, either for emissions trading systems, for how we're calculating emissions intensities by sector, by product, whatever, we're not all going to agree on the same process, and we don't need to, but we do need those metrics to be interoperable so that our trading systems can talk to each other. And we've been trading through the World Customs Organizations with common language for a long time. And I think we can do this. We'll get there, but it will require both first movers and clubs or collaborations. I agree with David. I'm not sure club is necessarily the right term, but some form of higher level collaboration.
Thank you for that. And I think particularly from a transatlantic point of view, there's also an interest in that conversation and in collaboration, with the EU focused more on a tax-based initiative and the US very much on regulation and subsidies. So aside from the metrics, I think there's an important transatlantic conversation to be had there as well. David, last words for you.
Okay, no, just yeah, to bounce on what Lauren was saying. Yes, CBAM has been for a long time perceived for something else than what it is. It is a measure that reflects the effect of the ETS at the border, and one very important element is that the first element that we look into for CBAM is the embedded carbon content of the goods. So if there are policies outside the EU that reduce emissions, either by a carbon price or by regulation or by subsidies, this will be reflected in the level of CBAM. All policies reducing emissions in partner countries will be reflected in CBAM. Then we will give a credit for a carbon price paid abroad, but that's second. The first thing that comes into play is the amount of emissions that can be attributed to good that is imported in the EU. And this is, in this club discussion, this is an element that is very important to allow that CBAM is articulated with measures that are deployed in the rest of the world.
Thank you. Julia, I'm really curious what our audience makes of this statement.
Well, we finally have a clear preference, with 66% of our audience voting against the statement. So meaning that Climate Club is not the only way through which CBAM can work. Now, with an eye on the time, I'm afraid that we cannot take any more questions, but I would like to thank everyone for their interest. And if you have any further questions or comments, feel free to send us an email. We would be very happy to further discuss this topic with you.
And from my side, let me also just thank all of our speakers. Let me thank David, Pierre, Dundee, Susanne, Lauren, Carolyn, and Pieter for sharing their insights with us. What I take away from this is that, yes, CBAM is a climate measure, but it definitely has trade ramifications. The more we invest in cooperation, conversation about CBAM, all the better, because perceptions are or seem to be a little bit skewed. And to answer the question that we posed in the title, can the EU avoid trade wars over climate policy? What I take from all our experts is a resounding yes, if we make the effort. And so with that, let me once again thank you all. Also, for those joining online, you've been very active with your polling. You will get one more poll at the end about this event. By all means, please fill it in. And let me also take the opportunity to thank my co-host, Julia, who did a terrific job. And with that, let me close and wish you a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.